Yo creo que hay en temas económicos hay personas y personajes, ¿no? Y estamos aquí ante un personaje que no amerita presentación, pero para cumplir con las formalidades haré una presentación de algunos de los elementos más importantes de su biografía. El doctor Torbeck es profesor emérito H.E. Babcock de Economics and Economics. Fue director del programa de Economía Comparativa y Desarrollo en la Universidad de Cornell. Es actualmente profesor de la Escuela de Graduados de esta universidad. Fue director del Departamento de Economía de la misma Universidad de Cornell. Y, bueno, como ustedes saben, ha hecho innumerables contribuciones en el ámbito de la economía y del desarrollo agrícola, ¿no? Desde las medidas de pobreza que todos conocemos, ¿no? El que no sepa, la FGT, la T es de Torbeck. En temas de desnutrición, pobreza, la matriz de contabilidad social y modelos de equilibrio general, además de aportaciones a la economía, a la política económica internacional. Bueno, como ustedes saben, es uno de los que desarrolló el índice Foster, Greer y Torbeck, índice que ha sido adoptado mundialmente como la medida de pobreza, tanto por el Banco Mundial como por agencias de las Naciones Unidas. Aquí mismo en México, la brecha de pobreza al cuadrado fue utilizada como una herramienta para la distribución de recursos del gobierno federal. Entre sus más recientes publicaciones está el impacto de la globalización en los pobres de América Latina, el impacto de la globalización en los pobres del mundo, experiencias de desarrollo de Taiwán, entre muchos otros. Ha sido además asesor económico de numerosas agencias norteamericanas de desarrollo, incluida la USAID, ha sido asesor de la FAO, de la OIT, del Banco Mundial, de la OSD y de muchas otras agencias de las Naciones Unidas. Así que, sin más, los dejo con el profesor Torbeck.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. It's a real pleasure to be here, and it's the third year in a row that I come to Mexico around this time. The last two times I came at the invitation of Coneval when they were working on a multidimensional poverty measure, and they had invited some experts. So I'm starting to know the ropes. The first thing I should do is to apologize for making my presentation in English. I'm sure that for many of you, your English is better than my Spanish. At one time, I was able to speak it rather well. I started my professional career in Lima, Peru. I spent a year in Lima. This was in the early 1960s. And I was already working on issues related to the income distribution as between different parts of Peru, the coast, the jungle, and the altiplano. So this is really where my interest in issues of income distribution and poverty started. Now, we've had an extremely rich session or set of sessions until now, and as I mentioned earlier, we probably reflect on a number of the concepts, the number of suggestions that have been made. What I'm going to try to do is to put the dot on the I's, as you will see, repeat a number of things that have been said rather well, and the only original part of my talk will be the third part, where I'm going to make some recommendations about some of the work that INEGI might want to consider doing in terms of the measurement of social welfare. So I think we can get started. Why does it not? Oh, Here, this one. Okay. So content of my presentation, 3 parts. The first part is, as I said, somewhat of a repetition of many of the things that you've heard so far. I'm going to go into an attempt at defining the social progress concept and discuss some issues related to measurement and also some issues related to mechanisms. The second part is going to be on what I know about the Mexican social index, with emphasis on the work of Coneval on the measurement of multidimensional poverty. And really the point that I want to make here is that Mexico, more than any country that I know, has gone further in the measurement of the different domains, the different dimensions of poverty, and that given the fact that Mexico has done so much work in this area, it shouldn't be that difficult to move into the somewhat broader area of the measurement of social progress. The whole issue of the measurement of social progress could be built on the foundations of what has already been done in terms of the measurement of multidimensional poverty. And then the third part of my talk, this is where I have a few new things to say. It is for you to determine how innovative they are or not, but I'm going to make a number of recommendations to INEGI regarding the measurement of social progress. The concept that I like is a concept of a social well-being profile. It's a concept that you can start at the individual level, and then you can aggregate at the municipal, district, and national level. So, first question, what is social progress? I'm very thankful to the organizers of this conference, of this seminar, to having invited me, because it forced me to read the Stiglitz-Sen-Fitoussi report, which in its English version is 292 pages, and it's extremely informative. But after completing the reading of it, I had as many questions perhaps as when I started, but there are a number of extremely valid, useful ideas which are brought to bear in this report. Okay, so what is well-being? Essentially, it consists of economic and non-economic well-being. If we start with economic well-being, this is relatively easy to define. There's been a lot of work over the years, starting in the 1970s, with the concept of basic needs. So I think many people would say that economic well-being consists of satisfying one's basic needs and wants. What is social well-being? This is a much more difficult concept to measure. It includes the various quality of life indicators in terms of health, education, nutrition, as well as some extremely intractable concepts such as social rights, justice, and cohesion. Okay, the one area that the Stiglitz-Sen-Fitoussi report made, I think, a contribution to was to make clear that socioeconomic development and, in general, social progress had to be sustainable. If the current level of well-being cannot be maintained for future periods and generation, then it is an artificial situation where the children or the grandchildren of the present generation will have to bear the cost. So I think one of the contributions of the Commission report is on emphasizing the importance of sustainability. So the definition that this leads us to is that social progress is defined as a sustainable improvement in economic and non-economic well-being over time. Okay, there are three key components which need to be measured: economic well-being, social quality of life, and sustainability. The conventional GDP, as a number of speakers have already emphasized, and of course as the Commission report made very clear, has a number of flaws. The first flaw is that it does not include household activities. So any activities within the households that are not monetary activities will not be counted as part of the GDP. Another flaw is that it doesn't make it possible to measure leisure and in general other non-market transactions. Now we all know that leisure activities can be are extremely important and that there is a concept of real time whereby you use essentially the rate that you earn in looking at leisure, and if you do this, income, of course, is considerably larger than it would be by ignoring it. A recommendation of the Commission was to use the concept of adjusted disposable income, which includes the imputed value of the benefits received by the households from non-monetary services provided by the government for such things like health, education, and nutrition. And John Scott, among others, talked at great length about it. It is clear that the economic profession and maybe the statistics profession has not gone far enough in terms of trying to measure these benefits from the benefit incidence side as from the cost side. So far, when we try to measure these benefits, we simply look at how much the government has spent on these measures, and we use this as the imputed value. But this is, of course, artificial and may not correspond to what the recipients felt they received. So we have to move into new methods in order to try to measure these benefits. One method could be contingent evaluation. Another method might be one that is based on willingness to pay. But again, notwithstanding the efforts of the World Bank and other researchers, there's been very little progress in this area. Now, with respect to the quality of life indicator, the Commission report mentioned health, education, personal activities, social connection and capital, environmental conditions bearing on the current state of well-being. And here it would be such issues as pollution, garbage disposal, which of course can have an impact on the quality of life, the quality of health, personal insecurity, and economic insecurity. So these are the quality of life indicators emphasized by the report. In a few minutes, we'll see that the Mexican social indicators contain practically all of these, except perhaps for one or two. Now, when it comes to the measurement of sustainability, this deserves a separate type of measurement because we're dealing with a stock. We're not dealing with a flow. The depletion of natural resources, and I think, I often work in Africa. when you look at so many of the African countries, you really see what the resource curse is all about. Countries that have or had a large stock of natural resources, oil, minerals, and essentially overuse those resources in order to increase GDP in the short run. But of course, since GDP in its current form does not allow for a negative value which would represent the reduction in the stock of natural resources, you have this artificial inflation. But what is a tragedy is that so much of the overuse of the natural resources in these countries has led to a kind of an intertemporal redistribution which benefited only a very few. You only have to think of Papa Doc Duvalier in Haiti to see a case of massive destructions of forests, of the environment, and in the African countries that I mentioned here, the curse of resources is obvious. The measurement of household consumption and the quality of life typically is done on the basis of flows rather than stock. When it comes to income and consumption, we can make some adjustment relatively well. It's much more difficult with the quality of life indicators. I'll go back to it in great detail in a few minutes. But when it comes to the sustainability objective, the Commission recommends a dashboard. In other words, a set of different indicators, no attempt to come up with any kind of scalar approach to sustainability. Now, one of the key problems in the process of socioeconomic development, and if you think of the process of socioeconomic development as ultimately leading to social progress, is the mechanisms which underlie the interrelationships among socioeconomic growth, inequality, and poverty. And I think it's important to try to clarify as much as possible this interrelationship. So if you start with a given development strategy in Mexico, in any developing country, the government has a certain development strategy in mind, and that strategy is going to affect different sectors of the economy in different ways. The structure of production is going to differ depending on that development strategy. And as a consequence of the structure of growth, you're going to have a certain GDP growth. But at the same time, that development strategy will have an impact on income inequality. And there's a lot of evidence that many developing countries, in the process of implementing the socioeconomic development strategies, did contribute to GDP growth, but at the expense of a much more uneven income distribution. Now, I'll come back to this in a minute. But then the next relationship is between GDP growth and distribution. Now, the old-timers around here, and nobody I think is as old as I am, but the old-timers around here remember the Kuznets law. And what the Kuznets law maintained was that when per capita growth increased over a certain range, let's say up to $1,200 per capita, the income distribution would tend to become more uneven, but after that, the income distribution would become more even. Well, I think it's quite clear that the Kuznets law has been dethroned. We can no longer talk about the law. It depends very much on the strategies followed by the countries, and it depends very much on the initial condition. So we can't say too much about the impact of GDP growth on inequality. Now, when it comes to the relationship between income distribution and GDP growth, there are two variants. The classical school, and here Kaldor would be the main author, maintained that an uneven income distribution was necessary to generate the investment, or first of all the savings, that would in turn be needed to have enough investment to generate economic growth. So in a way, the neoclassical economists were rationalizing the need for an uneven income distribution in order to generate economic growth. But in contrast, the so-called modern political economy of development, people like Danny Roderick and many others, take a very different view. They maintain that greater income inequality reduces economic growth. Why? Because it creates more insecurity, it may lead to political destabilization, it may create all kinds of problems, people hate uncertainty, and as a consequence, investment is going to fall and growth is going to fall. And I personally, if you were to ask which one of these two schools of thought I would definitely go with the modern version. Now, coming back to the impact of GDP growth on well-being, it depends very much on the structure of growth, as I mentioned. Is it pro-poor? Is it anti-poor? In a country at an early stage of development, if agriculture is discriminated against, it's typically going to be anti-poor, and it will have a positive effect on reducing poverty, but not a very great effect. At the same time, greater inequality is going to mean that for any growth rate, the impact on poverty reduction is going to be that much less. In technical terms, we would say that the elasticity of income growth with respect to poverty is a declining function of the degree of income inequality. So it's very clear that the emphasis which the Commission and this seminar has put on looking at inequality is absolutely sound. The last concept here is sustainability, and of course, if the growth pattern is not sustainable, you can continue for a while, but you reach the stage where beyond a certain point, the further growth may be very difficult, if not impossible. So the two strands I mentioned, Kaldor, New Political Economy of Development, we can say that inequality acts as a filter, as a brake. Growth is a necessary condition to improving well-being, but it is not sufficient, or to put it differently, if you want to have a relatively fast rate of social progress, it is important to look at the extent to which income inequality can be reduced. Now, there's been a lot of work within the context of sub-Saharan Africa, and one study, among others by Fosu, shows clearly that growth is transformed into poverty reduction in sub-Saharan Africa much more when the income distribution becomes more equal. Well, this brings me to the second topic, the Mexican social progress indicators, and I can go into this very quickly. The Mexican government emphasized poverty reduction as a main goal of development, and I applaud them for that. the Ley General de Desarrollo Social of 2004 had as its first objective assuring access to social development for the whole of the population. The law mandated that Coneval, in measuring poverty, must use information generated by INEGI on at least the following indicators: current per capita income, the average educational gaps, access to health services, access to social security, housing quality and space, access to basic housing services, access to food, and level of social cohesion. Now, Coneval in the last few years has worked very hard to try to come up with a essentially scalar measure of multidimensional poverty using the 8 dimensions above. Now, the first 7 indicators can be aggregated into a multidimensional poverty measure. I'll show you how in just a second, while social cohesion is much more intractable and essentially has been set apart. So the formula that the staff of Coneval put together after a series of experts had proposed multidimensional poverty measures such as Chakravarti, Foster, Gordon, and so on, had this following form where IPI, the multidimensional poverty for individual I, K is a number of dimensions of poverty, W is the weight which is assigned to each of these commodities, I is the subscript for individual in each of these dimensions. Now, one possibility starting at the individual level, and if you think in terms of equal weights, because essentially the whole question of how to weigh these different dimensions is an arbitrary issue, but let's start by assuming equal weights. It would be possible for each individual the deprivation, the normalized relative deprivation would be 10%. You could do this for the other dimensions of poverty. The problem here, and I'll get back to it in a second, the problem here is that some of these dimensions are not measured in a continuous sense, but are measured in terms of categories, and in some cases even binary, whether you have Social Security, whether you're a member of the Social Security Club or not. So to the extent that it is possible to convert, transform some of the categorical variables, ordinal variables, into cardinal variables, it is difficult to go all the way in terms of coming up with a total deprivation level in terms of distance for an individual I. The next step, of course, is you can aggregate across populations, and you can get total deprivation at the level of a municipality. So I mentioned the problem that some of the indicators are categorical, and for all these reasons, and particularly the fact that many of these indicators are categorical, the Coneval methodology has essentially accepted that each individual should be evaluated in binary sense as either being deprived below the poverty threshold or not deprived above the poverty threshold in each of the 7 dimensions. So the definition of poverty in Courneval is a person is found to be poor either when her income is below the poverty line, is not sufficient to acquire the goods and services to satisfy basic needs, or when her deprivation by social rights is greater than the established social standards. So basically it means that a person is poor either if it is income poor or if it is deprived in at least 2 of the quality of life indicators. And of course it would be that much poor if this person is deprived both in the income sphere and in the quality of life spheres. Now this leaves one concept that the law emphasized, which is social cohesion, and I don't know how much work has been done in the last year, but at the time I was here, this was again in October of last year, they hadn't gone any further than recommending at the municipal level that the Gini coefficient be used as a proxy of social cohesion at the municipal level. So, in conclusion, coming up with a scalar poverty indicators embracing the 3 components above is most complex. I would even add utopian. At the limit, you can come up with a scalar measure for income and for the quality of life indicators, but to add sustainability and social cohesion, I think is asking too much. Now, a key issue, of course, is what weight to apply, and the naive way, if you have 7 dimensions, would be to weigh each of the dimensions, give it a weight of 1/7. James Foster recommended in his measure that income be given a weight of 1/2 and the other quality of life indicators 1/12. It should add up to 1 if the calculus here is right. Okay, now I'm finally getting to the part which I think I have something to offer. That's for you to determine. But it's very clear that the strong methodological foundation which were built by Courneval and INEGI related to the measurement of multidimensional poverty should really provide the foundations for the measurement of social progress. My first recommendation is that INEGI can focus on the measurement of social progress and well-being by producing individual and collective, for example, at the municipal well-being profiles. Now, let me give you an example of a profile. And I hope this is well clear. What I have here, I have the income dimension, and then I have the other 1, 2, 3, 6 dimensions of the quality of life index. And what I would recommend is that you take the y sub ij, which would be the individual value in each of these dimensions, in each of the j dimension. But in order to make it comparable, normalize it by the deprivation level that has been selected by Courneval. So you can see here, if the actual level of well-being in a given dimension for an individual I, let's say for income, is exactly equal to income poverty line, then you would be at the point 1. If, on the other hand, as this diagram, as this profile suggests, each of the points here are above 1. It means that this individual is not deprived in any one of these dimensions. The interesting thing about this way of measuring is that it gives you the relative surplus, and in a minute we'll see the relative deprivation. So in this case, individual I might be 50% above the income poverty line, 20% above the food poverty line, and so on. Now again, an important qualification is that some of these variables are categorical, but as you will see, I recommend that INEGI try to move it into the cardinal realm. Okay, now suppose that at time 2 you have a new profile, which is this green profile. In this case, you could conclude that individual well-being has improved. And a statistician would talk about first-order stochastic dominance. It's unambiguous. In each one of the dimension, this individual I is better off. But if you have this situation, let's say at time 3, then it becomes ambiguous. Why? Because in at least one of the dimensions, in this case income, the individual is worse off than it used to be, but it is better off in all the other dimensions. And this is why I think that it is important, if you want to move in the direction of measuring, that you take into account the distance from the deprivation threshold, either positively or negatively. Now the next profile would be a profile, a well-being profile for poor. Again, as of last year, Corneval had thought that it would define an individual as poor if this individual was deprived in 2 dimensions. Here you see this individual is deprived in food and dwelling, therefore would be defined as poor. Now, one issue with this is that with this profile, this individual has a relative income surplus, you see the yellow bar here, but has a relative food deprivation. So in principle, there is the possibility of compensation. In principle, it might be possible up to a point to use some of the surplus in income to compensate for the deficit in food, for the food deprivation. So this is why any measure of well-being, I think, will have to take into account what happens above the line of deprivation as well as below. And this is, of course, in complete contrast with poverty measures where you ignore totally what the situation is above the poverty line. It's totally irrelevant what the income distribution is above the poverty line. But in the case of a well-being profile, it is essential, of course, to try to understand both deprivations and surpluses. Now here, I'm asking the following question, adopting the Corneval definition of poverty. Here I take 2 individuals, individual 1 and individual 2. Both of them are defined as poor because they both poor in terms of food and education, but clearly the profile of individual 2 dominates the profile of individual 1 for every dimension. So they would both be poor, but one person would be unambiguously less poor than the other. And this is, of course, the problem with the present definition of Corneval. But I fully understand that for the sake of convenience, for the sake of simplicity, it was very difficult to go beyond defining it as such. Okay, so my recommendation for INEGI is to attempt to convert binary and categorical indicators into cardinal indicators. for health, this should be possible, and certainly if you move into the direction of subjective interview, in the US, for instance, and in many countries, individuals are asked, what is your health, from excellent to poor on a scale of 5. So you can say 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. So within limits, it's possible to come up with cardinal indicators. Social Security, you're either a member or you're not, but I think one question would be within a household to say, well, how many members are there who are members of Social Security or of the health system? So the basis of these individual profiles, I would recommend that well-being profiles of median individuals for each of the 7 indicators would be taken to determine social progress. So the point here would be again to follow up on the recommendation of the Stiglitz Commission, which was to say means really don't tell you much, if anything, about distributions. Medians do. They are a much better measure of the state of income distribution. So one possibility would be to take, let's say, at the level of a municipality or district or whatever aggregation you want, the median level of well-being for each one of these measures. And here you might have cases of first-order stochastic dominance, where going from, I don't know, 2005 to 2007, maybe even 2008, the median level in a given municipality is above where it was 2 years previously. So this would be the formula that I would recommend. A possible measure of social well-being would be 1 over k, 1 over the number of dimensions, if you have 7 dimensions, 1 over 7. The weight, you'd have to decide on it, with a normalized median value of the inhabitants in this aggregation, in this municipality, normalized by the levels. So the advantage, as I said, is that you put everything in relative terms, and it depends, of course, on weights and on deprivation cutoffs. Now, another recommendation is that the shares of individuals deprived in each of the 7 dimensions at the municipal, district, and national levels be given over time, be reported by INEGI. And also it might be useful to provide information on how many dimensions a municipality is deprived, or the proportion of individuals in a municipality that are deprived in 1 dimension, in 2 dimensions, in 3 dimensions. This, even if you can't do much better, would give us an idea of the severity of poverty. Explore improvements in indicators of income, consumption. To what extent might you move in the direction of coming up with an adjusted gross disposable income figure? Could be useful. And I give here a few examples of this. I think it's extremely important to try to measure the imputed value of subsidized and free services received by households. I mentioned this at the outset. And adding a few questions to the surveys on contingent valuation, willingness to pay, might provide some of this information. I'm getting to the end of my story. You might also want to explore how far you can go in coming up with scalar well-being measures for the 6 quality of life indicators, including how sensitive the scalar measure would be to relative weights. When it comes to sustainability, I think the best you can do is a dashboard. I don't think you can go anywhere trying to go into a green accounting, at least not today. My final recommendation, and this may be the most important one, together with the poverty profile, is to consider a system of economic Gerardo, don't leave now, because that's the most important recommendation. And I was just going to say something about you, so I know I'm talking too long, but we're getting there. Consider developing a system of economic and social accounting matrices and extension. The concept is called Sesame. The architect of it was Stephen Koenig. Stephen Koenig was the Director General of the Dutch Central Bureau of Statistics, and he's now the chief statistician for the European Central Bank. And he shares one quality with Gerardo, which is that he was one of my students. I was his PhD supervisor, so you see you're in good company. Sesame is a statistical information system in matrix form, which with a set core of economic, environmental, and social indicators. It goes beyond the concept of the social accounting matrix, which was first recommended by Richard Stone, for which he won the Nobel Prize, by providing a conceptual and numerical linkage of related monetary and non-monetary phenomena. It also yields indicators such as daily calorie intake of the poorest group, average number of years of schooling. Indonesia has gone very far in that direction, and for those of you who are interested, I could go into this in more detail on a personal level. It allows for the integration of social progress objectives into traditional macroeconomic, fiscal, monetary policy preparation. So in short, it's an integrated statistical framework which provides a better basis for analysis and for modeling. And the great advantage is that it forces internal consistency between macro data sources, meso data sources, and micro data sources. And it answers the fundamental question of who gets what from where. And in fact, when we sold the social accounting matrix concept to the Indonesian statistical office, the way we sold it was to convince them that it was the best way to check the internal consistency of a variety of statistical sources: survey data, input-output data, trade statistics, national income accounts, and so on. And when they saw that, they were sold. So I think at the present time, Mexico is ideal to develop and implement Sesame, and I think it could be a very useful instrument in moving in the direction of measuring social progress. Thank you very much.
Profesor Torberg, muchas gracias. Bueno, como el profesor viene de más lejos que la mayor parte de nosotros, daremos espacio para un par de preguntas en lo que reunimos al resto, a los panelistas de la siguiente sesión. Entonces, si hay 3 preguntas específicas para el profesor. Solamente 3, no se amontonen. ¿No?
Y en español está bien.
O holandés, ¿no?
Holandés mejor.
adults, and also has indexes like how many refugees there are in each country, how good are the laws towards the people that is vulnerable, no? In a vulnerable situation. And I haven't seen in the whole day like all these indexes that has been done for the developing countries, for the underdeveloped, no? And I don't know, what do you think about that index?
Yes, I mean, maybe the difference, or maybe whatever I have to contribute is in terms of suggesting the relatives, the normalized Y sub ij divided by the deprivation level, so that by normalizing it, you make it possible to compare the levels, the relative levels of either deprivation or surpluses in the different dimensions. I think that in a way, it's a little bit analogous to what we did when we developed the FGT measure. It's also normalized by the poverty level. Of course, in a multidimensional sense, you have as many deprivation levels, poverty levels, as you have dimensions. And by taking the actual value of an indicator for an individual and by dividing it by the deprivation level, you put it in a relative comparable way.
Hi. Would you advise or to take into account the measure of vulnerability within this? Because the problem is that, well, if you look at the old school, there's this whole discussion about tropical countries. Remember when the sense of geography had to do a lot with things related to floods, dries, and so on. And now, in a lot of our countries, because of institutional weaknesses that we have, and lack of capacity to deal with them, it's very common that we have great shocks, great economic shocks, and social shocks. So in that sense, these kinds of shocks could affect not only at the aggregate level, but very much at the very household level, depending on which sector of the economy you are. So what would you think about that?
No, I think it's an excellent question. I mean, the concept of vulnerability is a very clear concept when you apply it to a poverty measurement. It is the probability of being poor sometime in the future. It reflects the extent to which you may not have assets in the future to cover any income shortfall due to a drought or due to a global recession or what have you. So the concept of vulnerability within the context of poverty analysis, I think, is very clear. The concept of vulnerability with respect to a multidimensional social well-being indicator is more difficult, because ultimately what you would have to do is to find out the extent to which an individual is vulnerable to shocks in each one of these dimensions. I think that's very hard. It's hard enough to just do it with income. Where I think empirical work has been done has been in rural areas like Ethiopia, where much of the income comes from agricultural production, and where you can measure what the impact of a drought is going to be on agricultural production and therefore on income. And you can, over time, when you have enough data, you can see in how many years these people were vulnerable. But clearly vulnerability is very important. But at this stage, I would operate step by step, and I would first try to come up with some kind of a social well-being composite measure before I would move too far into vulnerability.
Una última pregunta. Bernardo.
This one there. Yeah.
Just a question on how to weight the different factors would be to use econometric results of the level of association between the individual factors to any basic or reference index. This is used considerably in the literature, at least in the competitiveness literature and many others in economics and finance and so on. I wonder why did you discard, or what are your considerations with respect to that particular option?
Yeah. I would be very open. I mean, as I mentioned to you at lunch, the choice, the selection of weights is essentially arbitrary. There's nothing you can do about it. And in fact, Atkinson, who's probably the father of much of the work on inequality, says if you don't know any better, why don't you take equal weights? I mean, that's his answer. I think this is probably going a little bit too far. What I would do is I would use a variety of methods to try to come up with weights. One would be econometric techniques, principal components. There's been quite a bit of work there, and it's very mechanical, but it might tell you something about weights. I would use experts, health experts, education experts, policy makers who have a lot of experience, who understand the constituencies, who understand the political, the socio-economic reality, to give you not only the weights, but also the trade-offs. But I would also use interviews with focus groups. I would go to these villages, I would go to the municipalities and see how the individuals themselves, la gente, with two different dimensions, whether they really think that income is so much more important than the other dimensions, that it should be given a weight of 1/2, whether they think that food is so essential in terms of giving them the energy that they need to work, that they feel that access to food should be given a relatively high weight. And then on the basis of having obtained this information from many sides, do some sensitivity analysis. In some cases it doesn't make too much difference, which is fine. When it does make a difference, then ultimately use your judgment, but it's going to be an informed judgment. It's going to be based on having all these pieces of information.
Gracias. Entonces, dado que las tres preguntas estaban a menos de 1 metro de distancia una de la otra, ahora le pido por favor a los 4 panelistas, a Graciela Teruel, Susan Parker, Ryan McDonald y Gerardo Leiva, que por favor suban.